Starting from the mid-90s, all of the big players in the gaming industry began to alter their approaches with the advent of 3D gaming. It would take a little bit over half a decade for the implementation of the third dimension to become streamlined, whether it's the way the games looked, controlled, or just how they felt in general. Popular franchises would either learn to swim or sink into oblivion. During the Nintendo 64's lifetime, all of the main faces showed up. Mario, Zelda, F-Zero, Star Fox, and the like, but the Metroid games were nowhere to be seen. Not even in a 2D game in the same manner as Kirby or Yoshi. Which makes sense. Nintendo largely focused on 3D games during that era, and they often relegated the 2D stuff on Nintendo 64 to games that many people would view as easy or kiddie. They supposedly wanted to create a 3D Metroid game, but the series creator just didn't quite feel like it was ready yet. This obviously eventually led to the release of Metroid Prime on the GameCube, but it's still hard to wrap my head around the fact that Metroid straight up skipped a whole console generation, especially considering it had made it onto the 3 prior Nintendo consoles. Like, the Game Boy Color didn't even get a game, and I think I find it a lot weirder than the Nintendo 64 considering the other 2D mascots that made it to the handheld. So obviously, by the time we hit the early 2000s, 2D games just kinda became a handheld thing for a while. Very much an afterthought. They were lower budget, easier to make, and generated significantly less hype. The thing is, with the way the handheld industry has grown, it's actually kind of interesting, especially considering the past generation we've lived through the Switch and seen the other big players implement some form of cloud gaming to follow suit. But back then, the Game Boy was actually in a lot of ways more powerful than the NES, especially the Game Boy Color, which didn't have the monochrome screen holding it back. But the Game Boy Color obviously was not more powerful than the Super Nintendo, and we wouldn't get a handheld console more powerful than the Super Nintendo until the Game Boy Advance. For me, when I think about the 2D Metroid series, specifically the first 4 games, in my opinion, they were basically released to every 2D Nintendo console that was more powerful than the one before it, resulting in a game that would be a lot more improved than the one before. The unfortunate thing for Metroid fans was this meant there was a solid 8 years between the third and fourth Metroid title, which was basically double the previous 2 gaps. In hindsight, from a 2D retrospective lens, I think this was for the best, because when I play Fusion, I feel like I'm playing a game more advanced than Super in a lot of ways. And if Fusion had been on the Game Boy Color, then I definitely wouldn't have felt that. Now obviously, we could have gotten a 2D Metroid on Nintendo 64, but that wasn't what people wanted on the Nintendo 64, so I understand why it got relegated to next generation's handheld. But basically, in November of 2002, whether you wanted a 2D or a 3D Metroid game, you were satisfied, or at least cautiously optimistic. But to be clear, when I say Metroid Fusion is more advanced than Super, I'm not saying this to imply the gameplay is more advanced. These are 2 very different approaches to the Metroid formula, and I don't really think it's fair to say one is better than the other. I think that largely depends on what you're looking for in a video game. But the way Fusion feels, the way it looks, everything about how the game controls just feels so much better. Like, it took 4 games to get there, but with Fusion, I don't feel any jank at all with the way Samus operates. Super Metroid feels significantly more like a retro classic than Fusion does, and again, I'm specifically talking about the way the game feels. Everything just feels tighter, and Samus does what I actually want her to do whenever I press a button on my controller, and it makes a load of a difference. The discussion though is whether these changes are enough to justify the significant changes to the Metroid formula that Fusion comes with, and an even further discussion can be had if these changes even require justification. Because obviously, shortly after the time of its release, many Metroid fans kicked up a storm and were offended by what Fusion put on the table, but seeing as how this game has been out for 22 years, I'm not really sure if the perspective still prevails. But enough tiptoeing around it. Metroid Fusion is very much the next handheld Metroid title. When you look at the first 3 games, you find a more or less completely open world NES game, followed by a much more guided sequel on the Game Boy. But the Game Boy game isn't your typically guided title, it just basically unlocks more of the map as you proceed and reach your objective. It still requires you to get through the various areas you're in with your own Metroid style of exploration. And then when we got to the third game, it was much more similar to the first game, only this time, they found a way to add a bit of guidance to the adventure. First and foremost, you have a map system that tracks your progress. You're locked out of certain areas of progression unless you can accomplish some specific tasks and collect certain items. It's still a very open game in general, but they found a way to limit it just a bit more by guiding you, the player, through the adventure. Personally, I think the jump from Metroid on the NES to the Super Nintendo can be reflected upon in the same manner of the jump from Metroid on the Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance. In Fusion, you get a map with different sections that you're locked out of without further progression. But to take it a step further, your hand is very much held as you go through this adventure. Now granted, despite a target being set on the map for your guidance, you still have to use your own skills to figure out how to get to those certain areas, unlocking hidden locations in maps and finding different power-ups and the like. But the result is a game that is much more handholdy than not only Super, but the Game Boy game as well. Basically, in the same way that Super was a much more guided version of the NES game, I think Fusion is a much more guided version of the Game Boy game, which was already guided a lot more than the previous one, for better or for worse. There are a lot of positives to this implementation, and perhaps none more than the fact that you don't really get lost nearly as often. While I enjoy the concept of figuring it out on your own in previous games, there were definitely a few moments where I just wish the game would put a slight bit more guidance in how I proceed. I'll admit Fusion probably overcorrects, but when you consider that it was made as a handheld game, one that you could easily pick up and play for 10 to 15 minutes on a commute or whatever, it makes complete sense. So while I did find this game with probably just a little bit too much handholding, the fact that I didn't lose my mind and get lost for 3 hours was very welcome after my experience with Super. And honestly, I think the perfect Metroid game would lie somewhere between the philosophy of both of these games. But that's besides the point. There are a plethora of save rooms, navigation rooms, energy and ammo recharge rooms, and special colored doors that are unlocked when you find the room that unlocks them. This is all part of the way the game guides you, because when you're able to unlock a specific type of security door, it also means the X-Parasite are able to go through those doors now. And as far as the story is concerned, that's why they're all relegated to a single location at the time. To overcompensate for this sense of guidance, Fusion found other ways to make the game a bit more enticing. First and foremost, things were a lot more hidden in plain sight than they were in Super. There were many times where I was stuck in 2 or 3 rooms with little options of how to advance, where I had to keep running in circles until I figured out what I had to do to move on. Which in Super wasn't really that common, because in that game, the hard part was figuring out where I needed to be, and usually when I got there, it was much easier to figure out how to move forward. There are times in Fusion where I'd shoot the wall or floor and nothing would visually change, and in a few instances that meant I had to literally just go through an invisible block even though there was no indication that it was invisible. There were even a lot of moments that I had to run between 2 or 3 different rooms and create a path for myself so that I could do what was necessary to progress. While on a macro level, I think this game guided me much more than the previous, on a micro level, I think there were more bite-sized puzzles I had to solve to advance, which again, for the sake of it being a handheld game, I think that works pretty well. Even with the power-ups and collectibles, there were plenty of moments where you'd walk into a room and an E-tank or missile tank would just be right in front of you, but there were also a lot of times where you had no idea where the collectible was. The game will put a marker on the map, so you know something is there, but it's your job to figure out how to grab it, and in more than one instance, that held me down for a bit before I figured it out. One big downside, however, is that you can't really go too much off the rails. Like, if you're someone that wants to run around the map looking for stuff, you can only do it in the designated area you're meant to be in. There are 6 or 7 main areas of the game. At one point, I veered off and went to the next area that I wasn't meant to be in, and I was able to go through some rooms but couldn't really do anything without reaching a locked door. And likewise, I went and searched back in the previous area, and it was basically a ghost town. But when I'm in the area that I'm meant to be in, there's a lot of split paths, alternate routes, many different corridors to run through and explore. In a lot of cases, you'll reach a dead end, have to turn back and go the other direction, but during that detour, you'll find secrets and hidden items, even if you're not meant to be there yet. And as I was playing through the game, that didn't really feel too different to how it was during Super. The story of this game is, in my opinion, the most interesting one yet. And yeah, a lot of that is because there's a lot more lore here, with straight up text boxes explaining things as you move along. The game begins with Samus recovering from a severe accident. She had previously been infected by an X-Parasite, which almost cost her her life. The X-Parasite, an alien organism that can mimic other life forms, was the cause of her near-death experience. However, Samus' encounter with the parasite led to her receiving a life-saving vaccine derived from Metroid DNA, which also altered her physiology. I'm not sure what the general consensus is of the fusion suit, but I dig it. And I like how the colors and Parasite and the general vibe of this whole game feels very early 2000s-esque. Samus is sent to investigate in the Biologic Space Laboratories, or BSL for short, which has sent a distress signal. The station is orbiting around SR-388, the home planet of the Metroids, the same planet we eradicated all of the Metroids from in Metroid 2. But I guess we didn't do a good enough job because the distress signal is a result of biological catastrophes caused by a Metroid outbreak. As Samus arrives, she discovers that the station has been overrun by various dangerous organisms, including the Metroids. And the Metroid research on the BSL station has led to the release of the X-Parasites, which are highly infectious and deadly. These parasites begin to mutate the station's native organisms, creating horrifying new life forms. I love how they just take enemies we're used to from previous games and evolve them like they're some kind of Pokemon. My personal favorite is when they combine the fish with the space pirates to create the Space Pirates fish. It's so uncanny. But anyway, as Samus explores the station, she learns that the X-Parasites have been experimenting with Metroid DNA, leading to the creation of new formidable threats. One of the most significant threats Samus faces is the SAX, an X-Parasite infected clone of Samus' power suit. This entity possesses all of Samus's abilities and is extremely dangerous. It's actually jarring seeing the SAX in action. For starters, the close-up of its face can send shivers down anyone's spine, and it's also a lot stronger than the Samus we got to control in Super Metroid, straight up blasting doors and wrecking ships. There are a handful of areas throughout the game where you're basically doing a covert mission to avoid letting the SAX spot you, because if it spots you, it can, and will, annihilate you if you don't run away fast enough. The SAX relentlessly pursues Samus, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and fear throughout the game. This creature's presence drives the narrative, forcing Samus to avoid direct confrontation and rely on stealth and strategy. And as Samus traverses the BSL station, she uncovers various sectors, each with its own environment and challenges. These sectors include the main deck, research lab, and various biomes that showcase the station's diverse ecosystem and the impact of the X-Parasite. It's basically a bit of a video gamey explanation as to why all of these different areas of the game look drastically different. It's a research facility, and the scientists are able to make the varying biomes look and feel as they please. One of them straight up mimics SR-388, hinting that there are some kinds of tests going on with Metroids. Otherwise, why would they recreate their home environment? Throughout her exploration, Samus collects power-ups and upgrades her suit, which are essential for surviving and progressing. This can occur either by defeating an enemy allowing you to absorb its power, or by getting to a data download station. Honestly, I see people complaining about this a lot. I don't really care too much. I mean, you can kind of view it all as some form of microbiologic nanotechnology if you need to satisfy your headcanon. But finding a ball waiting for me in a room on an old bird statue in the previous game hidden in clear sight of the space pirates in their own homeworld wasn't exactly the super in-depth, brilliantly realistic lore implementation that so many Metroiders made it out to be. The point is, as you go through the game, you'll find these power-ups, and they're more or less what we've been accustomed to so far in the previous games. Only a bit more streamlined and easier to use so that you don't have to cycle through weapons, which makes a world of difference. Also, something I appreciate is whenever you defeat an enemy, you basically absorb the X-Parasite that's dropped. And those parasites restock your health and ammo, which, for the sake of being a contrarian, is a much better implementation of the whole system than Super ever was, when you consider you'd kill an enemy in Super and it'd just drop a missile. But yeah, from a gameplay perspective, this is all what you've come to expect after playing through the previous 3 games. Along your journey, Samus will have conversations with an AI that is running the station. This AI is basically your guidance throughout the game. She begins to associate it with Adam, her former commanding officer that died risking his life in saving her. There are some implications that are much further delved into in future games, but in the case of this one, that's all we really know. The big change here is that we actually get to hear Samus' thoughts as a result. It's a bit annoying, because she spends a lot of that time feeling like she's almost subservient to the AI because it reminds her of Adam, almost in a way that makes it seem like she misses him because he was in charge of her. It's just weird seeing Samus like this, because this is definitely not the Samus we all envisioned playing the previous games. But I'm willing to shrug it off as being a result of the X-Parasite infecting her. I don't know if that's actually the explanation of the lore, or if it's canon, but it's canon to me, because she changes way too much between Super and Fusion. Either that or she was just madly in love with Adam and has her own views of what she likes in a man. And in that case, I may not agree with it, but meh. Also, not really related, but the AI isn't Samus' only proverbial friend on board. Those same critters that taught her how to wall jump in the previous game are also here. It's nice to see them hanging out in their own little observatory. I'm glad we saved them at the end of Super Metroid. As Samus makes her way through the station, you'll notice some miscellaneous improvements in the game, like her ability to grab ledges, climb ladders, and move across monkey bars on the ceiling, and etc. She'll also be able to use power bombs in place of the X-ray scope to be able to quickly locate almost everything hidden in a room in a much more efficient manner than the X-ray scope ever could. Her capacity for power bombs and missiles will increase very quickly too, in addition to the E-tanks. And this is crucial because this game is actually difficult. One of the ways the developers managed to balance out the fact that this isn't as much of a Metroidvania is by really putting the action back in the action platformer. I don't think I died in Super, or if I did, it was probably like once or twice because I fell into acid or something. But here, oh, it'll happen a lot. Especially in the boss fights, as you learn how to overcome them. Credit to the game though, they're actually a really good lineup of boss fights, and they appropriately increase in difficulty too. And they're all basically infected with the X-Parasite, so when you beat them, you're often rewarded. But you also need to kill this annoying protective shell that gets harder with every boss and can actually defeat you depending on how much damage you took during the boss fight itself. So they start off fairly easy with a rematch against Arachnus in the main deck. If you remember, Arachnus was the only boss that you beat in Metroid 2 that wasn't a Metroid. The reward back then was a Spring Ball. In the case of this game, defeating Arachnus gives you the Morph Ball. In Sector 2, you'll face off against Zazabi. I don't know if you're required to let him engulf you, but I found that worked against him. I'm guessing using missiles and dodging would have been an optimal way to fight him. Sector 4 is a fight against Ceres. This one can be challenging because you have to basically quickly be ready to turn around and shoot like you're having a duel in some old western. Sector 3 has a fight against the robot box. If you recall in my Mario Advance video, I said the fight against Birdo reminded me of Metroid Fusion. This is the fight I was talking about. You swing off the roof and unload missiles onto its head. It takes a while to get used to dodging it, but once you figure out, it's all about patience and accuracy. In Sector 6, you face off against the barrier. I think I was trying missiles against this thing, so I swapped to the charge beam, and to my surprise it worked much better. Back on the main deck was a fight against Gedo. Gedo. G-E-D-O. It's a spider. This one was hard, but spiders are cool, so I didn't like killing it. Another Sector 2 fight against a plant core. This was basically the Mother Brain fight from the NES, except slightly less stressful, but the visuals of the vegetation were borderline breathtaking in this game. And then there was Nightmare, which is such a unique boss. It almost feels like it doesn't belong in this game. It takes place in Sector 5, really close to the end of the game, and it's very hard. I had to work on my space jump quite a bit in order to beat it. And then you get to another Sector 6 fight against a security robot, which more or less plays out the same as before. And this is a very solid lineup of main boss fights. And after the easy joke of encounters of everything in the previous game as well as Metroid fights in Metroid 2, it was nice to actually get somewhat of a challenge here, considering in Super it was really just Ridley's lair that required any form of typical boss fight challenge. Speaking of Ridley, at some point during this game you'll walk into basically a giant fridge and see his frozen carcass. When you re-enter the area later, it dissolves in front of your eyes. But of course, as you near the end of the game, you'll be in Sector 1, and you'll discover an infected incarnation of the big bad known as Neo Ridley. This is a boss fight. It does not disappoint. I'll admit, I got to this one with lower health than I should have, so that probably made it more challenging than it needed to be, but the only reason I was able to get through him is because at some point I realized using the charge beam was making him change colors quicker than the missiles, and that allowed me to defeat him. Man, Ridley is very much proving to be the largest test in every game he shows up in. I love it. And eventually, Samus discovers that the BSL station's research involved dangerous experiments with the Metroids, aiming to harness their energy-absorbing capabilities. She learns this by going against the AI's wishes and entering a restricted area and noticing tests being conducted on all of the evolved phases of the Metroids, which is a nice cameo of all the forms from Metroid 2. She learns that the X-Parasites have been manipulating and enhancing these experiments, leading to a creation of the SAX and other mutated creatures. When she eventually speaks to the AI regarding her entering the restricted area, the AI is bothered by the fact that she went against its orders and is surprised and concerned at her powering up, as it was intentionally trying to keep her from getting too powerful and finding out all this classified information. There were even moments early on where a mysterious third party asked the AI if Samus suspects anything, so there was clearly something fishy going on with this plot as we explored the ship. The AI wants Samus to stand down and wait for the arrival of the Galactic Federation, indicating that they're going to be disappointed with the damage Samus has done and is likely to continue doing. The Federation, which at this point sounds like it's basically the US Army, effectively wants to weaponize everything. The Metroids, the SAXs, yeah, plural, because apparently there's like 10 to 15 of them. All of it. Samus is rightfully concerned because she knows the Federation won't be able to contain any of this at all. And it could very likely mean the end of the galaxy. She pleads with the computer to let her free and eventually refers to it as Adam, the name of her former commanding officer. And this seems to trigger something in the AI, because as fortune would have it, the Federation actually downloads the minds of all their former commanding officers. So the reason Samus has been so odd in her conversations with this AI, the reason she's so seemingly out of character to all of this, is largely in part because she's almost literally communicating with the man that she probably loved that killed himself for her. And with Samus referring to the AI by its name, it basically triggers something in it too. It no longer wants to work against Samus, rather it wants to work with her. So he allows it. Samus is freed, she defeats the SAX in a somewhat difficult encounter, followed by destroying the abomination it turns into in a much easier encounter. Her and the Adam AI are now not only attempting to blow up the ship, which triggers the usual escape sequence, but they're blowing it up by setting it on course to SR-388 to destroy the planet as well, ending the life of all of the Metroids and X-Parasites down on the infamous planet. The very same planet that many eons ago the Chozo had created the Metroids on, creating them specifically so that they can destroy the X-Parasite. This would all now end at the hands of Samus, the very same bounty hunter that caused the X-Parasites to sprout specifically because she killed all of the Metroids on SR-388 in Metroid 2. It's honestly so poetic, and I just love when there's a lore payoff like this in a series that barely even has any story composition. And I know the lore gets even better as you go deeper into the series, and I look forward to that composition as well. But just based off of what we have here, this is a very good story that I'm surprised doesn't get as much praise as it should. Or maybe it does and I'm just in the wrong circles, I'm not sure. As Samus makes it towards her ship, she notices it's not there. The timer is still ticking though. She frantically looks around, and all of a sudden she's bombarded by a frickin' Omega Metroid. The strongest of the Metroids. It turns out the tests they've been conducting on these things, the experiments they were doing to allegedly use the Metroids for safety and to do good and all the fluffy stuff humanity has been lied to about for centuries, all in order to create a weapon? Yeah, in all of their experiments, they found a way to expedite the evolution of the Metroids. They were able to make an Omega Metroid in a fraction of the time that it would normally take. And that Omega Metroid is ready to destroy Samus. She can't even lay a finger on it. And with a quick swish of its claws, it completely throws her to the side, rendering her unable to move. But this time, there's no baby Metroid to save her. But lucky for her, there is a parasite that's drastically looking out for its own survival. The SAX swoops in and does a ton of damage to the Omega Metroid. But it's still weak because of its previous encounter with Samus. The Omega Metroid defeats it, and in a final act of desperation, in a final attempt at defiance to ensure its survival, it allows itself to fuse into Samus, which gives us back our full control of the truest and strongest form of Samus, and gives us the Ice Beam, letting Samus completely annihilate the Omega Metroid without even needing to use the missiles. And with the defeat of the Omega Metroid, her ship returns to the docking bay, piloted by none other than those very same critters she saved at the end of Metroid 3. And the game ends with Samus reflecting on her ordeal and the personal changes she's undergone, as well as the ongoing threat that such biological experiments pose to the galaxy. And look, I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you that Metroid Fusion is better than Super Metroid. That was never my intention with this video. Nor was it my intention to write a thesis defending why I like Fusion more than Super, because I'm not even sure that I do. What I do know, however, is that there are a lot of aspects of Fusion that I enjoy more than Super. The boss fights, the control, even the aesthetics. I like the vibrant colors because they fit in with the story. I like that it's brighter, even though it's only brighter because the original Game Boy Advance didn't have a backlit screen. The brightness puts you more into focus, and seeing as how this game is a lot more about quick-time focus rather than slow-paced hunting, the visuals make it a lot easier to remain alert. I even like the story of this game. It's not perfect, and there are some reservations I have at this point in the series towards Samus and her mannerisms, but they're not so far out of place that I'd say they ruined her character. Regardless, the biggest flaw in Fusion is that it's just barely a Metroid game. Like, it doesn't stray so much that I think you can say it's not a Metroidvania, but it's really stretching that line. And in that case, I can totally understand why this game would bother some people if they think Super is the perfect implementation of the Metroid formula. The thing is, I don't think Super holds that title. In the same way I think Fusion leans too far to the left in the Metroidvania meter, I think Super leans too far to the right. They're both almost perfect, and I think a combination between these two games might actually be the perfect 2D Metroid. Many years ago, Zero Mission was the first Metroid game I had ever played to completion, and I haven't played it since that first playthrough. I'll see you next time. As always, thanks for watching. Dean out.